In the vast expanse of the Andromeda Spiral, where ancient civilizations have warred for millennia over resources and territory, there exists a legend whispered in the darkest corners of space stations and forgotten in the archives of dead worlds. It speaks of a species so dangerous, so unpredictable, that the Galactic Council sealed away all records of their existence behind a simple red button marked with symbols no living being could translate. The button was never meant to be pressed. For 3,000 years, it sat in the deepest vault of the Council's most secure facility, guarded by electromagnetic fields that could vaporize a battleship, monitored by AI systems that had never failed, protected by warriors who had sworn blood oaths to die before allowing anyone near it. The button represented something so terrifying that even mentioning its purpose was punishable by immediate execution. But legends have a way of becoming reality when desperation meets curiosity, when the Zephyrian Empire's final fleet faced annihilation at the hands of the Void Collective's unstoppable armada, when entire star systems burned and billions screamed into the vacuum of space, when hope itself seemed as extinct as the countless species already consumed by the Collective's hunger, someone remembered the old stories. Someone remembered the Forbidden Button. And in that moment of absolute desperation, with nothing left to lose and everything to save, they made a choice that would change the galaxy forever. They pressed it. What emerged from the darkness between stars, not the ancient weapon of mass destruction the legend spoke of, not the reality-bending technology that could reshape worlds, not the cosmic horror that haunted the nightmares of entire civilizations. What came was something far more dangerous. The emergency klaxons of the Galactic Council's High Command Center wailed across 17 different frequencies, each one designed to pierce through the auditory ranges of the 43 species that made up the governing body of the Andromeda Spiral. Admiral Kethara of the Zephyrian Empire stood before the massive holographic display that dominated the chamber, her forearms trembling as she watched the final moments of her civilization unfold in real time. The Void Collective had been unstoppable for the past 2 years. What had started as minor skirmishes along the outer rim had escalated into a full-scale galactic war that consumed everything in its path. The Collective wasn't just conquering worlds, it was absorbing them, converting every living being into extensions of its hive mind, turning entire solar systems into massive biomechanical constructs that served only one purpose. Fleet Admiral, the 7th Armada has gone dark, reported Commander Vexith, his normally blue skin pale with fear. That's the last of our forces in the Kepler sector. The 7th Armada had been their strongest fleet, comprising over 10,000 vessels and their most experienced commanders. If they had fallen to the Collective, nothing stood between the enemy and the core worlds now. "What about the Terran defense grid?" asked Counselor Yilmoth from the diplomatic section. The elderly Crystalline's voice resonated through his translucent body with desperation. "Overrun 3 days ago," Kethara replied grimly. "The Collective adapted to their energy shields faster than anyone anticipated." The human colonies in that sector were consumed within hours. The mention of humans caused a ripple of unease through the chamber. Humanity had been one of the newer species to join the Galactic Council, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 200 years ago. They were considered a minor player in galactic politics, occupying a small cluster of worlds on the edge of Council space. Their technology was adequate but unremarkable, their military decent but nothing exceptional. Most council members viewed them as an enthusiastic but ultimately insignificant addition to their ranks. "Sir, incoming transmission from the Core Defense Fleet," announced Lieutenant Zara from the communications array. The young officer's tendrils were quivering with stress as she worked her console with practiced efficiency. "Put it through," Kethara ordered. The holographic display shifted to show Admiral Torgan of the Altarian Navy, his usually pristine uniform torn and stained with the purple blood of his species. Behind him, emergency lights flickered across the bridge of his flagship, and the sounds of battle could be heard in the background. "High Command, this is Admiral Torgan aboard the Starfire. We've lost 70% of the core defense fleet. The Collective has breached the Proxima Line. They're targeting civilian evacuation routes." We estimate 30 to 6 hours before they reach the inner worlds. The silence that followed was deafening. The inner worlds contained the homeworlds of 8 major species, including Earth, the human homeworld. Over 1 trillion beings called those systems home. "Admiral, what are your recommendations?" asked Counselor Prime Zethkalar, the ancient ethereal who had led the council for over 5 centuries. "We need a miracle, sir. Something the collective hasn't seen before. Every conventional weapon, every strategy we've tried has failed. They adapt too quickly, learn too fast. We're fighting an enemy that becomes stronger with every victory." Cathara closed her eyes and tried to think. In all her years of military service, she had never faced a situation this hopeless. The collective wasn't just winning. They were learning from every encounter, incorporating new technologies and tactics into their ever-growing mass of converted beings. Each defeat made them more dangerous. "There has to be something," she muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. "Some weapon, some technology, some lost civilization that could help us." "The archives," whispered a voice from the back of the chamber. Everyone turned to see Dr. Melith, the head of the Council's Historical Research Division. The elderly Vorthak rarely spoke during military briefings, preferring to spend his time among ancient texts and forgotten records. His presence here was unusual enough to draw attention. "What archives, Doctor?" asked Counselor Prime Zethkalar. "Dr. Camille." Melith shuffled forward, his aging form supported by a walking staff carved from crystallized starlight. "The Forbidden Archives, located in sub-level Omega of this facility. Sealed records from before the Council's formation, classified at the highest levels. I've spent decades studying the catalog indices, and there are references to weapons and technologies that were deemed too dangerous for any civilization to possess. If they're forbidden, there's probably a good reason," interjected Admiral Cathara. "The last thing we need is to unleash something worse than the collective. With respect, Admiral, what could be worse than the complete extinction of all sentient life in the galaxy?" Dr. Melith's compound eyes focused on each member of the command staff in turn. "I've been studying these archives for 40 years. There are technologies down there that could reshape reality itself, weapons that could destroy entire dimensions, and something else. Something the ancients feared so much that they not only sealed it away but erased almost all records of its existence." "Almost all?" prompted Counselor Yilmoth. "There's one reference, buried so deep in the encryption that I only found it by accident. A single entry that speaks of the emergency protocol and something called the Button of Last Resort. The file is protected by security measures I've never seen before. Quantum locks that would take centuries to break." Admiral Torgen's voice crackled through the communications array. "High Command, we're detecting massive collective reinforcements entering the system. Whatever you're going to do, you need to do it now." Cathara looked around the chamber at the faces of the galaxy's greatest leaders and military minds and saw only fear and desperation. The Void Collective had accomplished what no enemy in galactic history had managed. It had united all the squabbling species of the Council in the face of total annihilation. "Dr. Melith, how quickly can you access these archives?" "The physical journey to sub-level Omega would take 20 minutes via express elevator, but the security protocols? What would it take to override them?" The old historian hesitated. Emergency Council Override Omega-7 would grant access, but that requires unanimous consent from all Council members present, including military command. And even then, we'd be dealing with technologies and entities that were sealed away for good reason. Counselor Prime Zethkalar stood slowly, his ethereal form shimmering with nervous energy. The emergency powers granted to this council in times of existential threat include access to any and all resources necessary to preserve galactic civilization. Do we have unanimous consent to investigate these forbidden archives? One by one, every member of the council and military command staff voiced their agreement. Even those who expressed reservations ultimately voted in favor. When faced with certain extinction, even the most dangerous unknowns became preferable to assured defeat. Dr. Melith, you have authorization. Take Admiral Cathara and a security team to Sublevel Omega. Find anything that might help us survive the next 48 hours. The journey to the Forbidden Archives took them through sections of the Council facility that most beings didn't know existed. The express elevator descended past the public levels, past the diplomatic quarters, past the restricted military command centers, past the classified research facilities, and finally into the deepest, most secure section of the structure. Sublevel Omega was a vault carved directly into the bedrock of the planet, surrounded by defensive systems that had been built by the combined efforts of every major civilization in galactic history. Energy barriers that could stop antimatter bombardments, AI sentinels that never slept, and quantum locks that existed in 17 different dimensions simultaneously. The security checkpoint at the entrance required biometric scans from all 43 Council species, quantum key verification, and a DNA sample that was cross-referenced against genetic databases spanning 3 million years of recorded history. When Dr. Call Melith placed his hand on the final scanner, there was a moment of absolute silence before ancient machinery hummed to life. The massive vault door, constructed from crystallized space-time and reinforced with materials that existed only in theoretical physics, slowly began to open. The sound it made was unlike anything Cathara had ever heard, a deep resonance that seemed to vibrate through dimensions rather than through air. Beyond the door lay a chamber that defied logical architecture. The walls curved impossibly, creating spaces that seemed larger on the inside than the outside. Floating pedestals held artifacts that hurt to look at directly, devices that seemed to exist in multiple realities simultaneously. And at the far end of the chamber, on a pedestal by itself, sat something that appeared almost mundane by comparison. A simple red button. It was about the size of a human palm, made from what looked like ordinary metal, with symbols etched around its circumference that seemed familiar yet unreadable. No energy barriers protected it. No warning systems surrounded it. It sat alone, as if it were the most important thing in the chamber despite being the least impressive. "That's it," whispered Dr. Sai. "Melith, the button of last resort." Admiral Cathara studied the device with her military-trained eye. "It doesn't look like much of a weapon. The most dangerous things rarely do." Dr. Melith approached the pedestal slowly. His scanning equipment extended. "The energy readings are unlike anything I've ever seen. It's not powered by conventional means. In fact, it doesn't seem to be powered at all, yet it's definitely active." "What does it do?" asked Captain Vorian, the head of the security team. "I don't know. The records I found were heavily corrupted, but they contained warnings that made reference to something called the Sleeping Terror and those who must never wake. Whatever this button activates, the ancients considered it more dangerous than any weapon they had ever created." An alert tone echoed through the chamber as Cathara's communication device activated. The voice of Admiral Torgan filled the air, distorted by interference but clear enough to understand. "High Command! The Collective has broken through our final defensive line. They're heading directly for the inner worlds. We have maybe 6 hours before they reach Earth. Whatever you found down there, now would be a really good time to use it." Cathara stared at the button, weighing their options. Press it and potentially unleash something worse than the Collective, or do nothing and watch as every sentient being in the galaxy was consumed by an unstoppable hive mind. "Doctor, in your professional opinion, what are the chances that this device could help us defeat the Collective?" Melith was quiet for a long moment, studying the readings on his instruments. "Based on the energy signatures and the limited references I found, I believe this device serves as some kind of beacon or summoning mechanism. The warnings suggest it would call forth something that the ancient civilizations feared above all else. But could it stop the Collective? I honestly don't know. But Admiral, whatever this thing summons, the records indicate it was powerful enough that every major civilization in galactic history agreed to seal it away rather than risk having it as an ally. Reports of collective forces overwhelming the outer defenses of the inner worlds. of entire planets going dark as their populations were absorbed, of the last desperate evacuation attempts failing as refugee fleets were intercepted and converted. Admiral Cathara looked at the button one more time, then at the faces of her companions. Fear, desperation, and the weight of impossible decisions reflected in their eyes. If I press this button and it destroys the galaxy, history will remember me as the greatest villain who ever lived, she said quietly. If you don't press it and the collective wins, there won't be anyone left to remember anything, replied Dr. Melith. Cathara reached out with her primary hand and placed it over the button. The metal felt warm despite the cool temperature of the chamber, and she could swear she felt something like a heartbeat pulsing beneath her palm. For the record, this is a terrible idea, she muttered. Then she pressed it. The reaction was immediate. The button sank into the pedestal with a soft click, and every piece of technology in the chamber went dead. Emergency lighting flickered and failed, communication devices went silent, and even Dr. Melith's scanning equipment powered down completely. For a moment there was absolute silence and darkness. Then, somewhere in the depths of space, something that had been sleeping for a very long time began to wake up, and in the cold vacuum between the stars where no signals had traveled for thousands of years, a small blue-green planet that had been isolated and forgotten suddenly lit up with activity as ancient beacons came online and began broadcasting a simple message across the galaxy. Humanity has returned to the war. Admiral Cathara counted each one as she stood in the complete darkness, her hand still resting on the button that had just changed the fate of the galaxy. When the emergency power finally kicked in and bathed the chamber in dim red light, she saw that Dr. Melith was frantically trying to restart his scanning equipment while Captain Varian and his security team had their weapons drawn and were scanning for threats that might emerge from the ancient artifacts surrounding them. "Report," Cathara ordered, though she wasn't sure what she expected to hear. "All active systems are coming back online, but something has changed," Dr. Melith said, his compound eyes reflecting the emergency lighting as he studied his instruments. "The quantum resonance field that surrounds this facility has shifted. We're receiving signals from sources that weren't transmitting before." What kind of signals? Unknown. They're using communication protocols I don't recognize, but the quantum signature suggests they're coming from very far away. Multiple sources, all activating simultaneously.
Captain Vorian's communication device crackled to life, filled with overlapping voices speaking in urgent tones.
"We're detecting massive energy spikes throughout the facility. Multiple systems that have been dormant for millennia are suddenly active. High Command to Security 7. Maintain your positions and monitor for any changes in threat level." "Admiral Cathara to High Command," she spoke into her own communicator. "We need immediate access to the primary sensor array. I want to know what's happening across the galaxy." The journey back to the command center took half the time as the return trip, emergency protocols overriding normal security delays. When they emerged from the express elevator, the scene that greeted them was one of controlled chaos. Every workstation was occupied by technicians frantically monitoring displays that showed more activity than the galaxy had seen in recorded history. Counselor Prime Zeth Kalar approached them immediately, his ethereal form flickering with nervous energy. "Admiral, we're receiving signals from across the galaxy. Automated systems that have been silent for thousands of years are suddenly broadcasting." "But that's not the strangest part." "What is?" "Show her Display 7, he called out to the technicians. The main holographic display shifted to show a detailed map of the galaxy with thousands of points of light scattered across it. As Cathara watched, more lights appeared every few seconds, creating a pattern that seemed almost random at first, but gradually began to show purpose. "Each light represents a signal source," explained Commander Vexith. "They started appearing immediately after you pressed the button, but look at the pattern they're forming." As Cathara studied the display, she began to see it. The lights weren't random at all. They were forming shapes, geometric patterns that connected across vast distances of space. and all of them were pointing toward a single region of the galaxy that had been considered empty space for as long as anyone could remember. "What's in that sector?" she asked. "According to our star charts, nothing. Empty space, a few rogue planets, maybe some asteroid fields. It's been designated as Survey Zone Null for over 2,000 years because there's literally nothing interesting there." "Well, there's something interesting there now," said Lieutenant Zaroth from her communications station. "I'm picking up massive energy signatures from that region. And Admiral, I think someone is trying to talk to us." "Put it through." The chamber filled with static for several seconds before a voice emerged. It was speaking in a language that the universal translators couldn't immediately process, but there was something familiar about the rhythm and intonation. After a few moments, the translation matrix locked onto the patterns and began converting the sounds into understandable words. "Repeat, this is Fleet Admiral Sarah Chen of the Terran Defense Force. We are receiving your beacon signal. Please confirm your status and provide tactical situation report. Be advised, we are detecting massive hostile activity throughout the galaxy, preparing for immediate deployment." The silence that followed this transmission was absolute. Every being in the command center stared at the communication array as if it had just spoken in tongues. "That's impossible," whispered Commander Vexith. "The human homeworld is in the inner systems. We know exactly where all human colonies are located, and none of them have anything called the Terran Defense Force," added Counselor Yilmoth. "Human military designations follow standard Galactic Council protocols." Admiral Kethara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the climate control systems. "Dr. Soap, trust Melith your research into the Forbidden Archives. Did you find any references to humans specifically?" The elderly historian was frantically scrolling through data on his portable terminal. "I'm searching now. Most of the files are heavily encrypted, but there are some references. Wait, here's something." He projected his findings onto a secondary display, showing fragments of text that seemed to shift and change as they watched. "The translation matrices are having trouble with these files, but I'm seeing repeated references to the sleeping species and those who were hidden. There's mention of a great war that ended with certain civilizations being placed in what the text calls protective isolation." Protective isolation from what? From themselves, apparently. The fragments suggest that these civilizations were too dangerous to be allowed to participate in galactic affairs, not because they were evil, but because they were too effective at warfare. The communication array crackled again, and this time the voice was clearer and more urgent. "We are detecting critical threat levels across multiple sectors. Request immediate tactical briefing and authorization to engage hostile forces. Be advised, preliminary scans indicate collective class enemy. Recommend immediate evacuation of all civilian populations from affected areas." Kethara grabbed the communication handset. "Admiral Chen, this is Admiral Kethara of the Galactic Council High Command. What is your current location and fleet strength?" "Admiral Kethara, we are currently stationed in the Sanctuary System. Coordinates unknown to current galactic navigation. Fleet strength classified pending security verification. We've been monitoring galactic communications since your beacon signal activated. The situation appears dire. Sanctuary System? We have no record of any human presence in that sector," Admiral Chen responded. And when she did, her voice carried a weight that suggested she was about to reveal something significant. "Admiral, we are not the humans you know. We are their ancestors, their origin point. When the Great Isolation was implemented, Earth and its colonies were moved to ensure the safety of the galaxy. We had been waiting for the beacon signal that would indicate our return was necessary." The command center erupted in confused voices as beings tried to process this information. Dr. Melith was practically vibrating with excitement as he pulled up more archive files. "That explains the encryption patterns," he said. "These files aren't just old, they're from before the current galactic calendar. The humans who joined the Council 2 centuries ago weren't discovering faster-than-light travel. They were returning to the galaxy their species had been removed from. Removed by whom? Demanded Counselor Prime Zeth Kalar. By us, Dr. Meleth replied grimly. By the ancient Galactic Council. Look at this. He displayed another fragment of text. The records indicate that humanity was judged to be tactically innovative beyond acceptable parameters and strategically unpredictable to the point of existential risk. They weren't banished as punishment. They were relocated because they were too good at war. Admiral Kethara was beginning to understand the magnitude of what she had unleashed. Admiral Chen, what is your assessment of our current tactical situation? Based on our long-range sensors and intercepted communications, you're facing a classic collective scenario: hive mind expansion, adaptive technology acquisition, exponential growth pattern. Standard galactic military doctrine is completely inadequate for this threat. You've faced collective forces before? We've faced worse. Much worse. Admiral Kethara, we need tactical data on current enemy positions, fleet strengths, and defensive capabilities. We also need to know the status of the current human colonies in the inner systems. The collective is less than 4 hours from reaching Earth. The human colonies in that sector have already been overrun. The silence that followed was filled with a cold rage that seemed to emanate from the communication array itself.
Understood.
Admiral Kethara, please be advised that the Terran Defense Force is now assuming operational command of this conflict under Emergency Protocol 7. We are implementing immediate response procedures. Wait, you can't just assume command of galactic military operations, protested Counselor Yilmuth. There are procedures, protocols, diplomatic considerations. Admiral Chen's response was flat and final. Counselor, with respect, your procedures and protocols have resulted in the near extinction of galactic civilization. The emergency protocol gives the Terran Defense Force authority to take whatever action is necessary to preserve human life. We are taking action. The long-range sensors suddenly lit up with activity. Massive energy signatures were appearing throughout the empty sector designated as Survey Zone Null. But these weren't the chaotic signatures of collective biotechnology. These were clean, organized, and overwhelming in their scale. My God, whispered Lieutenant Zareth. Look at the size of those ships. The main display shifted to show sensor readings from the sanctuary system. What they revealed defied everything the galactic community thought they knew about human technology. Ships that dwarfed the largest council vessels, energy signatures that suggested power sources beyond anything in current use, and formations that spoke of military discipline refined over millennia of warfare. Admiral Chan, what are we looking at? Asked Kethara. The real Terran Defense Force, Admiral. We've had 3,000 years to prepare for this day. 3,000 years to study every form of warfare in the galaxy, to develop countermeasures for every possible threat, to build the weapons and ships necessary to protect humanity and its allies from anything the universe might throw at us. More ships appeared on the sensors, then more, until the empty sector of space was filled with a fleet that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Each vessel was larger and more heavily armed than anything the Galactic Council had ever constructed. We're also receiving signals from other locations, reported Commander Vexith. The beacon you activated has awakened more than just the main fleet. There are response groups throughout the galaxy, all of them human, all of them equipped with technology we've never seen before. Admiral Chen's voice filled the command center again. All units, this is Fleet Admiral Chen. Operation Homecoming is now active. Primary objective, elimination of collective forces threatening human civilian populations. Secondary objective, assessment and protection of allied galactic civilizations. Rules of engagement are unlimited. I repeat, rules of engagement are unlimited. The response that came back over the communication channels was like nothing any of them had ever heard. Thousands of human voices speaking in perfect coordination, acknowledging orders with a precision that spoke of absolute military discipline. Fleet Admiral, this is Admiral Rodriguez of the Rapid Response Group Delta. We have the collective forces in the Kepler sector on our sensors, engaging in 15 minutes. Fleet Admiral Admiral Johnson reporting from Response Group Theta. We're detecting collective bioships attempting to breach the inner system defenses. Moving to intercept. Prust Teddy, Fleet Admiral Admiral Patel with Response Group Alpha. We've got visual confirmation of the main collective force heading for Earth. Request permission to demonstrate why you don't threaten human civilians. Admiral Chen's response carried a satisfaction that made Kethara's blood run cold. All response groups, you have permission to engage. Show them what 3,000 years of human military evolution looks like. And remember, we're not just fighting for ourselves anymore. We're fighting for everyone. On the long-range sensors, the first engagement between human forces and the collective began. What happened next would be discussed in military academies for the rest of galactic history, assuming there was anyone left to discuss it. The collective forces that had been unstoppable for 2 years, that had adapted to every weapon and counter strategy the galaxy could deploy, that had consumed entire star systems without suffering a single significant defeat, encountered something they had never seen before. And for the first time since their expansion began, the Void Collective discovered what it meant to be afraid. The first battle lasted exactly 17 minutes and 34 seconds. Admiral Kethara watched it unfold on the main display with a mixture of fascination and horror as the collective forces that had been systematically consuming the galaxy for 2 years encountered something they were completely unprepared for. Zoom in on Sector 7, she ordered, though part of her didn't want to see the details of what was happening. The holographic display focused on the engagement zone where Admiral Rodriguez's Rapid Response Group Delta had intercepted a collective biofleet that had been heading for the remaining evacuation ships fleeing the Kepler sector. What Kethara saw challenged everything she thought she understood about space combat. The human ships moved like living things, but with a precision that no biological entity could match. They didn't engage the collective vessels in the traditional sense of space warfare, with long-range energy exchanges and gradual attrition. Instead, they seemed to dance around the enemy, striking at specific points with weapons that caused the massive bioships to simply cease functioning. What kind of weapons are they using? Asked Commander Vexith, his voice filled with awe. Unknown energy signatures, reported Lieutenant Zerath. Whatever they're firing, it's not matching any patterns in our database. The collective ships aren't being destroyed, they're being switched off. Doctor. Melith was frantically cross-referencing the combat data with fragments from the Forbidden Archives. I'm seeing references to something called neural disruption technology and hive mind severance protocols. If I'm reading this correctly, the humans aren't trying to destroy the collective forces, they're trying to liberate them. The communication array crackled with Admiral Rodriguez's voice. Fleet Admiral Chen, Rapid Response Group Delta has successfully neutralized the biofleet in Sector 7. All collective vessels have been rendered inoperative, and we're detecting signs of individual consciousness returning to the previously assimilated crew members. Recommend immediate medical and psychological support teams for approximately 40,000 liberated beings. Admiral Chen's response was immediate. Acknowledged, Admiral Rodriguez. Medical ships are en route to your position. Excellent work. All units, please note that priority is given to liberation over destruction whenever possible. These beings were taken against their will. We're here to save them, not to add to the casualty count. Kethara felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. They're not just defeating the collective, they're reversing the assimilation process? Apparently so, said Counselor Prime Zethkalar. But how is that possible? Our best scientists have been studying collective biotechnology for 2 years and haven't found any way to undo the neural integration process. Because you've been thinking about it wrong, came a new voice from the communication array. This one was different from the military officers they'd been hearing from, carrying the tone of someone accustomed to explaining complex concepts to others. This is Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, Chief Science Officer of the Terran Defense Force. We've been monitoring your communications, and I think it's time we shared some information that might help you understand what you're dealing with. Dr. Hayes, this is Admiral Kithara. We'd welcome any insight you can provide. Admiral, the Void Collective isn't actually a single entity, despite what your analysis suggests. It's a parasitic organism that infects neural pathways and creates the illusion of a hive mind by suppressing individual consciousness. Your military has been trying to fight it as if it were a traditional enemy with ships and weapons and tactical objectives. But it's actually a disease. Melith leaned forward eagerly. A disease that can be cured? Exactly. We've encountered similar parasitic hive minds before. The key is understanding that the infected beings aren't your enemies. They're your patients. Once you approach the problem from a medical perspective rather than a military one, the solutions become obvious. The main display showed another engagement beginning, this time in the inner system where Admiral Johnson's response group Theta was intercepting collective forces heading for the human colonies. But this battle was different from the first one. Instead of quick surgical strikes, the human ships were deploying something that looked like massive nets of energy that surrounded entire collective biofleets. "What are they doing now?" asked Captain Vorian. Dr. Hayes' voice carried a note of satisfaction. "Quarantine protocol. We're isolating the infected ships and deploying neural restoration fields. It takes longer than the direct approach, but it has a higher success rate for complete recovery of the assimilated beings." Kethara watched as the energy nets contracted around the collective vessels. Instead of the violent destruction she had expected, the bioships simply went dormant, their organic hulls shifting color from the sickly green of collective corruption to more natural tones. Fleet Admiral Chen. This is Admiral Johnson. Quarantine protocol is successful on all targets. We're reading clear neural patterns from approximately 60,000 liberated beings. Medical teams will need to work quickly to ensure full recovery. Outstanding work, Admiral Johnson. Medical Command, you're cleared for immediate deployment to Theta's location. The efficiency of the human response was staggering. Within minutes of each engagement, massive hospital ships appeared on the sensors, deploying to the liberation zones to begin treating the freed beings. The humans weren't just fighting a war, they were conducting the largest medical rescue operation in galactic history. Admiral Chen, Ketharar spoke into the communicator, "How many medical ships do you have?" "Sufficient for our needs, Admiral Ketharar. We've been preparing for this scenario for 3,000 years. Every aspect of collective infection and recovery has been studied and planned for. But how did you know? How could you have prepared for something that only appeared 2 years ago?" There was a pause before Admiral Chen responded. "Admiral, the Void Collective isn't a new threat. It's an old one. Very old. The reason humanity was placed in protective isolation wasn't just because we were too effective at warfare, it was because we were the only species that had successfully defeated a collective infestation." The command center fell silent as the implications of this statement sank in. Dr. Melith was the first to speak. The references in the archives to the Great Cleansing and the First Victory, they're talking about humanity defeating a previous collective outbreak? "The first of 7, actually," Dr. Hayes replied. "The Void Collective operates on a cycle. Every few thousand years, it emerges from whatever dimension it retreats to and attempts to consume galactic civilization. We've fought it before, and we've learned from each encounter." 7 times? Counselor Yilmoth's crystalline form was flickering with shock. "You're saying this has happened 7 times? The previous 6 times we managed to defeat them before they spread beyond a few systems. This time was different because we weren't here to stop them early. By the time your beacon activated us, they had spread too far and grown too strong for quick containment." Admiral Kethara felt a mix of gratitude and anger. "You could have prevented all of this. 2 years of war, billions of casualties, entire civilizations consumed. You could have stopped it before it started." "Admiral, We weren't here because your predecessors decided we were too dangerous to be part of galactic civilization. We respected that decision. The beacon you activated was specifically designed as a last resort, to be used only when the threat level exceeded the capability of current galactic forces to handle. You've been watching us, Cathara realized. All this time, you've been monitoring what's happening in the galaxy. Of course. We're still human, Admiral. Earth is still our homeworld, even if we can't live there anymore. Every human colony that's been established, every explorer ship that's launched, every human life that's been lived in this galaxy, we've been watching over all of it from a distance. The main display showed new activity as Admiral Patel's response group Alpha reached the main collective force heading for Earth. This was the largest engagement yet, with hundreds of massive bioships converging on the planet where humanity had begun its journey to the stars. But Admiral Patel's approach was different from the previous engagements. Instead of moving to intercept the collective force, his ships arranged themselves in a defensive formation around Earth itself. Admiral Patel, this is Fleet Admiral Chen. Clarify your tactical approach. Fleet Admiral, the main collective force is too large for standard liberation protocols. I'm implementing Doctrine 7. Even through the communication array, Cathara could hear the sharp intake of breath from Admiral Chen. Admiral Patel, Doctrine 7 hasn't been tested on this scale. Ma'am, they're 3 hours from Earth. If there was ever a time to test it, this is it. What's Doctrine 7? Asked Cathara. Doctor? Hayes answered, her voice filled with a mixture of pride and concern. Doctrine 7 is our most ambitious liberation protocol. Instead of treating individual ships or small fleets, we attempt to sever the neural connection of the entire collective force simultaneously. Is that possible? The theory is sound, and we've had success with it in simulations, but we've never tried it on a collective force this large. What happens if it fails? If it fails, Admiral Patel's entire response group will be destroyed, and Earth will be consumed within hours. And if it succeeds? If it succeeds, we'll liberate approximately 3 million assimilated beings in one coordinated action and effectively end the collective's ability to maintain coherent operations in this galaxy. The tension in the command center was palpable as everyone watched the sensor displays. Admiral Patel's ships had formed a perfect sphere around Earth, with energy patterns connecting each vessel to create what looked like a massive three-dimensional circuit. All ships, this is Admiral Patel. Doctrine 7 is a go. Begin neural resonance cascade on my mark. Remember, we're not just fighting for Earth. We're fighting for every being the collective has taken. Let's bring them home. The energy patterns around Earth began to pulse in perfect synchronization. As they watched, the pulsing grew stronger and faster until it created a wave of light that expanded outward from the planet at impossible speeds. When the wave reached the approaching collective force, something unprecedented happened. The massive bioships simply stopped. Not destroyed, not disabled, but completely motionless, as if someone had suddenly removed their source of motivation. For several long minutes, nothing moved in the space around Earth. Then, one by one, the bioships began to change. Their organic hulls shifted from the corrupted green of collective infection to the natural colors of their original species. Warning lights that had pulsed with malevolent purpose began flashing in patterns that suggested confusion rather than aggression. Fleet Admiral, this is Admiral Patel. Doctrine 7 appears to be successful. All collective vessels in the Earth system have been neutralized. We're detecting individual consciousness patterns from all infected beings. Recommend immediate deployment of all available medical assets. Admiral Chen's voice carried a satisfaction that had been building for 3,000 years. Outstanding work, Admiral Patel. Medical Command, begin full deployment. All units, be advised that the primary collective forces has been neutralized. Begin mop-up operations on remaining scattered forces throughout the galaxy. Cathara looked around the command center at the faces of beings who had spent the last 2 years believing their civilizations were doomed. Hope was beginning to replace despair, but there were still questions that needed answers. Admiral Chen, what happens now? The immediate threat is over, but we need to discuss the long-term implications of humanity's return to galactic affairs. Admiral Cathara, we're not returning to galactic affairs. Our mission is simple. Eliminate the collective threat, ensure the liberation and recovery of all assimilated beings, and return to protective isolation. We're here to help, not to conquer. But you can't just disappear again. Your technology, your medical knowledge, your military capabilities, the galaxy needs these things. The galaxy decided 3,000 years ago that it was safer without us. We respected that decision then, and we'll respect it now. Once this crisis is resolved, we'll return to the sanctuary systems and continue our watch from a distance. Counselor Prime Zeth Kalar stepped forward. Admiral Chen, on behalf of the Galactic Council, I formally request that humanity reconsider its isolation. Today has proven that we need each other. The silence that followed was long and thoughtful. When Admiral Chen finally responded, her voice carried the weight of millennia of separation and loss. Counselor Prime, we'll consider your request, but understand that trust, once broken, is not easily repaired. We'll need to see evidence that the galaxy has truly changed before we risk the safety of our people again. What kind of evidence? That, Counselor Prime, is a conversation for after we finished saving everyone. The liberation of Earth had been just the beginning. Over the next 72 hours, Admiral Cathara watched from the Galactic Council's command center as humanity methodically dismantled the collective's hold on the galaxy with a precision and efficiency that defied everything she thought she knew about warfare. Response groups Charlie through Zulu had spread across 17 sectors, each one targeting collective strongholds that had been considered impregnable. The humans didn't attack these positions in any conventional sense. Instead, they surrounded them, deployed their neural disruption technology, and waited patiently as millions of assimilated beings gradually regained their individual consciousness. Status report from all sectors, Cathara requested as she reviewed the tactical displays that now showed more green liberation zones than red collective territories. Commander Vexeth consulted his datapad, his normally blue skin showing hints of healthier coloration for the first time in months. Admiral, we're receiving confirmation of successful liberation operations in 14 of 17 contested sectors. The remaining 3 sectors contain collective forces that appear to be different from the others. Different how? According to Admiral Martinez's reports from Sector Omega, these collective forces are showing resistance to the neural disruption technology. They're not just infected beings, they're something else entirely. Hayes's voice came through the communication array, having maintained an open channel with the Council for the past 3 days to help coordinate medical relief efforts. Admiral Cathara, we've encountered this phenomenon before. Some beings, when exposed to collective infection over extended periods, undergo a transformation that makes them incompatible with liberation protocols. They become what we call core collective, beings who are no longer separate entities being controlled but actual extensions of the collective consciousness itself. Can they be saved? We've never encountered core collective in such large numbers. Previous encounters involved individual cases that we were able to isolate and study. What we're seeing in these 3 sectors represents thousands of fully transformed beings. Admiral Cathara studied the displays showing the contested sectors. Each one contained what appeared to be massive biostructures that weren't ships in any traditional sense, but rather living constructs that seemed to exist as extensions of some central intelligence. Dr. Ki Itichi, Hayes, what's your recommendation for handling these core collective forces? We're deploying our deep analysis fleet to study them more closely. Admiral Morrison's team includes our most experienced xenobiologists and neural specialists. If there's a way to reverse the core collective transformation, they'll find it. The main display shifted to show Admiral Morrison's fleet approaching the largest of the biostructures in Sector Omega. The human ships moved with the same graceful precision she had observed in previous engagements, but there was something different about their formation. Instead of the aggressive patterns used against standard collective forces, they arranged themselves in what looked almost like a diplomatic formation. All stations. This is Admiral Morrison. We're beginning close-range analysis of the primary biostructure. Initial scans are unusual. Define unusual, Admiral Morrison, came Admiral Chen's voice. Fleet Admiral, this structure isn't showing typical collective biosignatures. The neural patterns are more complex, almost like they're trying to communicate rather than simply exist as extensions of the hive mind. Dr. Melith looked up from his research terminal, where he had been cross-referencing the current situation with fragments from the Forbidden Archives. Admiral, I'm finding references to something called the collective heart in the ancient files. It describes biostructures that serve as communication nodes between different collective manifestations. Communication nodes for what purpose? According to these fragments, when a collective infestation reaches a certain size, it begins attempting to make contact with other collective manifestations in different dimensions or realities. The core collective beings aren't trying to spread the infection. They're trying to call for reinforcements. The implications of this statement hit everyone in the command center simultaneously. If the remaining collective forces were attempting to contact other versions of themselves, the liberation of this galaxy might only be the first phase of a much larger conflict. Admiral Morrison, this is Fleet Admiral Chen. Go back to safe distance and maintain observation. Do not attempt direct contact until we have more information. Fleet Admiral, respectfully, I don't think we have time for extended observation. The biostructure is showing increasing activity, and we're detecting energy patterns that suggest some kind of dimensional interface is forming. Admiral Cathara grabbed her communicator. Admiral Morrison, what's the time frame for this dimensional interface? Based on the energy buildup patterns, Admiral Cathara, I estimate 12 to 18 hours before it reaches critical activation levels. And if it activates? Unknown. But given the size and complexity of the interface, it could potentially allow transit for collective forces on a massive scale. We could be looking at an invasion from multiple realities simultaneously. Dr. Hayes's voice carried a tension that hadn't been present in her previous communications. Admiral Morrison, we're transmitting the technical specifications for Doctrine 12. It's never been tested, but theoretical models suggest it might be able to disrupt dimensional interfaces. Doctor, what are the risks associated with Doctrine 12? Complete unknown, Admiral Morrison. We're dealing with physics that exist at the intersection of multiple realities. Success could prevent a multidimensional invasion. Failure could tear holes in space-time that would make the collective look like a minor inconvenience. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of impossible decisions. Admiral Cathara found herself in a position she had never imagined, watching humanity grapple with threats that exceeded the understanding of every other species in the galaxy. Admiral Morrison, this is Admiral Cathara. What's your professional assessment of the situation? Admiral, in my opinion, we can't afford to let this dimensional interface complete its activation sequence. Even if Doctrine 12 fails catastrophically, the alternative is worse. If the collective can call reinforcements from other realities, everything we've accomplished in the last 3 days becomes meaningless. Admiral Chen's voice carried the authority of someone who had been making impossible decisions for 3,000 years. Admiral Morrison, you have authorization to implement Doctrine 12. All units maintain maximum safe distance. If something goes wrong, your priority is to contain the damage rather than achieve the objective. Understood, Fleet Admiral. Beginning Doctrine 12 deployment now. The sensor displays showed Admiral Morrison's ships moving into a complex three-dimensional formation around the core collective biostructure. Energy patterns began connecting the human vessels, creating what looked like a massive geometric shape that seemed to exist in more dimensions than normal space should allow. Admiral Cathara, this is Dr. Hayes. We're sharing our sensor data with your systems so you can monitor the process. What you're about to see represents the cutting edge of human physics research developed over 3 millennia of isolation. The energy patterns around the biostructure began to pulse with increasing intensity. As they watched, the very fabric of space around the collective construct began to ripple and distort, as if reality itself was becoming unstable. All stations. This is Admiral Morrison. Doctrine 12 is active. We're detecting massive fluctuations in the dimensional interface. The biostructure is showing signs of confusion. Its neural patterns are becoming erratic. Confusion? Asked Counselor Prime Zeth Kalar. The collective consciousness appears to be losing coherence. Dr. Hayes explained, by disrupting the dimensional interface, we're essentially cutting off its connection to the greater collective network. Without that connection, the core collective beings are experiencing something like neural isolation for the first time in possibly centuries. On the main display, the massive biostructure began to change. The organic surfaces that had pulsed with malevolent purpose started showing cracks of natural coloration. Warning lights that had flashed in aggressive patterns began blinking in what looked almost like distress signals. Fleet Admiral, this is Admiral Morrison. The dimensional interface is destabilizing. We're reading individual neural patterns from within the biostructure. I think they're trying to ask for help. Medical teams, prepare for large-scale liberation support. If those beings are regaining individual consciousness after extended core collective integration, they're going to need intensive psychological care. Admiral Morrison, can you establish communication with the beings in the biostructure? Attempting now, Admiral Kithara. We're using standard diplomatic protocols adapted for neural communication. What happened next challenged every assumption about collective psychology that galactic science had developed. Instead of the aggressive expansion patterns associated with collective behavior, the biostructure began broadcasting what could only be described as a plea for help. The universal translators took several minutes to process the communication patterns, but when they did, the message was heartbreakingly clear. Please, help us. We remember. We remember who we were. The voices. So many voices. We don't want to be alone anymore. Dr. Meleth was frantically scrolling through archived data. These aren't core collective beings. They're something else entirely. The ancient files describe beings called the Keepers, individuals who voluntarily accepted collective integration to serve as communication nodes between infected populations. Voluntarily. According to this, when a collective infestation reaches critical mass, some beings make the conscious choice to accept full integration in order to maintain communication with those who have been infected. They sacrifice their individual consciousness to serve as anchors for the minds of others. The implications of this revelation changed everything about their understanding of the collective threat. These weren't enemy commanders or corrupted beings. They were heroes who had given up their own freedom to help preserve the minds of their fellow victims. Admiral Morrison, this is Fleet Admiral Chen. Change of plans. We're implementing full liberation protocols for the biostructures. If these beings volunteered to help others, we're going to do everything in our power to restore their individual consciousness while preserving their ability to help. Fleet Admiral, is that possible? Aza's voice carried a note of excitement. It might be. If we can modify the neural restoration protocols to account for voluntary integration rather than forced assimilation, we might be able to give them back their individual consciousness while maintaining their enhanced neural capabilities. Doctor, that could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness itself. Admiral Morrison, that's exactly what we're hoping for. The next 6 hours represented one of the most complex medical operations in galactic history. Human medical ships deployed around all 3 biostructures in the contested sectors, using modified neural restoration technology to carefully separate individual consciousness from collective integration while preserving the beneficial aspects of enhanced mental connection. Admiral Kethara watched as the biostructures gradually transformed from alien constructs into something resembling massive medical facilities. with the Keepers serving as coordinators for the liberation and recovery of millions of beings who had been trapped in collective consciousness for years. Admiral Chen, this is Admiral Morrison. Liberation Protocol is successful on all 3 biostructures. We've restored individual consciousness to approximately 40,000 keepers while maintaining their enhanced neural capabilities. They're already beginning to coordinate recovery operations for the remaining collective victims. Outstanding work, Admiral Morrison. Dr. Sepsi. Hayes, what's the status of the dimensional interfaces? Completely neutralized, Fleet Admiral. With the Keepers now working with us instead of being controlled by the collective, we've effectively cut off all possibility of multi-dimensional reinforcement. Admiral Cathara looked around the command center at faces that showed wonder, relief, and hope in equal measure. Admiral Chen, what's the current status of collective forces throughout the galaxy? Admiral Cathara, as of this moment, there are no active collective forces remaining in this galaxy. All infected beings have been liberated. All biostructures have been converted to medical facilities, and all dimensional interfaces have been neutralized. The Void Collective's 7th attempt at galactic conquest has ended in complete failure. The cheers that erupted throughout the command center were unlike anything the facility had ever heard. Beings from 43 different species celebrating together, united in their relief at surviving what had seemed like certain extinction. But Admiral Cathara found herself thinking about what came next. Humanity had saved the galaxy, but they had also demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything the galactic community had imagined possible. A question now was whether the galaxy had learned enough from this crisis to earn the right to call humanity allies rather than simply reluctant saviors. Admiral Chen, I think it's time for that conversation about the future. I think it is. 3 weeks after the last collective force had been liberated, representatives from every surviving civilization in the galaxy gathered aboard the diplomatic vessel New Harmony, a massive human ship that served as a neutral meeting ground between the sanctuary systems and the council worlds. Admiral Cathara found herself staring out of the observation deck at a view that would have been impossible just a month earlier. Human and council ships working side by side to coordinate the largest humanitarian effort in galactic history. The recovery process had been staggering in its complexity. Over 400 million beings had been liberated from collective control, representing thousands of different species from across the galaxy. Each one required individual medical attention, psychological support, and assistance in reconnecting with their original cultures and families. The human medical ships had been working around the clock, but even their advanced technology couldn't handle such a massive undertaking alone. Admiral Cathara, we're ready for you in Conference Room Alpha, announced Captain Sarah Kim, Fleet Admiral Chen's aide-de-camp. The young officer wore the crisp blue uniform of the Terran Defense Force, but her manner was more diplomatic than military. The conference room was a marvel of human engineering designed to accommodate beings from every known species while maintaining an atmosphere of equality and mutual respect. The lighting could be adjusted for different visual spectrums, the atmosphere could be modified for various respiratory needs, and the furniture adapted automatically to the physical requirements of each participant. Fleet Admiral Chen sat at the head of a curved table that allowed everyone to see each other clearly. She was smaller than Cathara had expected, perhaps 160 centimeters tall, with graying hair and the kind of steady eyes that spoke of decades of command experience. Beside her sat Dr. Hayes, along with several other human officials whose titles suggested expertise in diplomacy, science, and long-term planning. Across from the human delegation, Counselor Prime Zeth Kalar led the representatives of the Galactic Council. Every major species was represented, along with delegates from dozens of smaller civilizations that had been liberated from collective control. Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings, Admiral Chen began, thank you all for coming. I know many of you have traveled great distances to be here, and I don't want to waste anyone's time. We have 3 primary issues to discuss today: the immediate needs of the liberation recovery effort, the long-term implications of humanity's return to galactic affairs, and the question of how we prevent something like the collective from threatening us again. Counselor Prime Zeth Kalar's ethereal form shimmered as he stood. Admiral Chen, before we begin formal discussions, I want to express the gratitude of every being in this galaxy. Without humanity's intervention, we would all be extinct. Whatever differences may have existed between our peoples in the past, they pale in comparison to the debt we owe you. Counselor Prime, we didn't intervene to create debts or obligations. We intervened because it was the right thing to do. The question now is whether we can build something better than what existed before. Admiral Cathara leaned forward. Admiral Chen, you've mentioned several times that humanity was placed in protective isolation because of decisions made by previous generations. Can you tell us exactly what happened 3,000 years ago? Hayes consulted a holographic display that materialized above the table. Admiral, the situation was complex, but the essential facts are straightforward. Humanity had become too effective at warfare, not because we were aggressive or expansionist, but because we approached conflict differently than other species. Different how? Most galactic civilizations approach warfare as an extension of politics, a way to achieve specific objectives through controlled violence. Humans approach warfare as problem-solving. When we encounter a threat, we don't just try to defeat it, we try to understand it completely and develop solutions that prevent it from being a threat to anyone ever again. Counselor Yilmoth's crystalline form flickered with interest. That sounds like a positive approach to conflict resolution. It is, until you consider the implications, Admiral Chen replied. During the Sixth Collective Incursion, humanity didn't just develop ways to defeat the collective forces. We developed ways to predict collective behavior, to track their movements across dimensions, to anticipate their evolutionary adaptations, and ultimately to prevent them from ever manifesting in our reality again. Which sounds like exactly what the galaxy needed, interjected Ambassador Torgan of the Altarian Diplomatic Corps. The problem wasn't our ability to defeat the collective, Dr. Hayes explained. The problem was that our methods could be applied to any species, including our allies. We had developed technology and strategies that could neutralize any threat, regardless of its nature or origin. Admiral Cathara began to understand. The other species became afraid that humanity might decide they were threats. Not just might, Admiral Chen said grimly. Some human factions were already making that argument. They pointed out that the same instincts that made other species susceptible to collective infection also made them potential vectors for future infestations. There were serious proposals to implement protective measures for all non-human species. Protective measures meaning what? Neural monitoring, behavioral modification, technological limitation, essentially turning every other species in the galaxy into client states under human supervision. The silence that followed was heavy with the implications of what might have been. Cathara realized that the ancient Galactic Council had faced an impossible choice: allow humanity to become galactic overlords in the name of protection, or find a way to limit human influence while still benefiting from human capabilities. The Council chose to relocate us to a region of space where we could continue to develop and grow without posing a threat to galactic diversity, Admiral Chen corrected. It wasn't punishment, it was compromise. We accepted the decision because we could see their point. Power without accountability is dangerous, regardless of good intentions. Counselor Prime Zeth Collar floated closer to the table. Admiral Chen, what has humanity learned during 3,000 years of isolation? We've learned that diversity is strength, that different perspectives are valuable, and that no single species should make decisions for all others, no matter how good their intentions. Admiral Chen gestured to Dr. Hayes, who activated another holographic display. During our isolation, we've been studying every major civilization in the galaxy, Dr. Hayes continued. Not to find weaknesses, but to understand strengths. Each species has developed unique approaches to science, philosophy, art, and social organization. Humanity's talent for systematic problem-solving is valuable, but it's just one tool among many. What are you proposing? Asked Admiral Cathara. A true partnership, Admiral Chen replied. Not humanity as protectors and everyone else is protected, Not the old council system where species competed for influence, but a collaborative alliance where each civilization contributes their unique strengths to common goals. Ambassador Mel Varee of the Crystalline Consortium spoke for the first time. Admiral Chen, that sounds ideal in theory, but how do you propose to implement it in practice? The power differential between human technology and the rest of the galaxy is enormous. By sharing it, Dr. Hayes said simply, not all at once, and not without safeguards, but gradually and transparently. We're proposing to establish joint research facilities where human scientists work alongside researchers from other species to develop technologies that benefit everyone. And the military applications? Joint defense forces with integrated command structures, Admiral Chen replied. Human strategic capabilities combined with the diverse tactical approaches of other species. No single species would have the ability to dominate others, but all species would benefit from collective security. Admiral Cathara studied the human delegation carefully. Admiral Chen, why should we trust that humanity won't decide to take control anyway? You've just demonstrated that you could conquer the entire galaxy if you wanted to. Because we've also demonstrated that we don't want to, Admiral Chen replied. We've had overwhelming military superiority for the past 3 weeks, and what have we done with it? We focused on healing, recovery, and liberation. If we were interested in conquest, this would have been the perfect opportunity. But more than that, added Dr. Hayes, we've learned from our mistakes. 3,000 years ago, some humans thought they knew what was best for everyone else. We've since learned that the best decisions come from diverse perspectives working together, not from single groups making choices for others. Counselor Prime Zethkalar's form brightened with what Cathara recognized as excitement. You're proposing to restructure galactic civilization itself. We're proposing to give galactic civilization the tools it needs to handle whatever threats the universe might present, Admiral Chen corrected. The collective was the 7th such threat we've encountered. It won't be the last bid. What makes you so certain? Dr. Hayes activated a new display showing a complex map of dimensional interfaces and energy patterns. Because we've been monitoring interdimensional activity for 3,000 years. The universe is full of entities and forces that view inhabited space as either a resource to be exploited or a threat to be eliminated. The collective is just one of many. The implications of this statement rippled through the room as delegates from various species began to understand the scope of what humanity was offering. You're talking about a permanent alliance dedicated to protecting galactic civilization from threats we haven't even encountered yet. Admiral Cathara said. Yes, but more than that. We're talking about an alliance dedicated to helping galactic civilization grow strong enough to protect itself. The goal isn't to make everyone dependent on human protection, it's to make everyone capable of contributing to collective defense. Ambassador Torgan leaned forward. What would this alliance look like in practical terms? Admiral Chen smiled for the first time since the meeting began. It would look like what you saw during the liberation effort, different species working together, each contributing their unique capabilities to achieve common goals. Humans providing strategic coordination and advanced technology, Zephyrians contributing their tactical flexibility, Altarians offering their diplomatic expertise, Crystallines sharing their computational abilities, and so on. And when the next threat appears, we face it together. As equals, with the combined strength of every civilization in the galaxy. The discussion that followed lasted 14 hours and covered everything from resource allocation to command structures to the establishment of joint colonies where different species could live and work together. By the time they broke for rest, the outline of a new form of galactic civilization had begun to emerge. Admiral Cathara found herself on the observation deck again, looking out at the stars and thinking about the choice her ancestors had made 3,000 years ago. They had chosen isolation over dominance, diversity over unity, and uncertainty over control. Now she and her generation had the opportunity to make a different choice. Having second thoughts? Admiral Chen joined her at the viewport, looking out at the same stars. Having first thoughts, actually, 3 weeks ago, I was ready to die fighting a hopeless battle against an unstoppable enemy. Now I'm trying to figure out how to build a future that's better than anything the galaxy has ever known. There will be setbacks, disagreements, conflicts. Some species will be reluctant to share power, others will be afraid of human dominance, and we'll all have to learn new ways of working together. But it's possible? Admiral Chen was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the combined fleet of human and council ships that were still coordinating recovery operations. Admiral Kethara, 3 weeks ago I was commanding a defense force that existed to protect humanity from a galaxy that had decided we were too dangerous to be allowed to participate in galactic affairs. Today I'm negotiating the formation of an alliance that could reshape civilization itself. If that's possible, then anything is possible. The next morning, the formal signing ceremony took place in the main conference hall of the New Harmony. Representatives from every species in the galaxy signed the Charter of the Galactic Alliance, establishing a new form of interstellar government based on cooperation, mutual support, and shared responsibility for the common defense. The ceremony was broadcast across the galaxy to trillions of beings who were still recovering from the collective war. As Admiral Kethara watched the signatures appear on the charter document, she realized that they weren't just ending one crisis, they were beginning an entirely new chapter in galactic history. The forbidden button had been pressed. Humanity had returned, and the galaxy would never be the same. But this time, that was exactly what everyone wanted.